A 0-day, a criminal form listing, and a wave of unverified claims. ShinyHunters flooded the threat landscape this week, but cutting through that noise is exactly what we're here to do. This episode, what's real, what's credible, and what your team needs to act on.
Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Tehman and John, Senior Manager of Gray Matter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today, as mentioned, we're covering ShinyHunters. They've been very active in the last couple of weeks with 0-day exploitation and multiple posts on their forums and social media sites selling access and data that's been captured from previous compromises.
And most of our listeners probably have heard the name ShinyHunters multiple times before. We've covered them in previous episodes as well. But another campaign has developed for the group. It is highly likely that they have been exploiting the 0-day in Oracle PeopleSoft's Environment Management Hub, tracked as CVE 2026-35273, which has likely already led to many organizations being compromised.
Yeah, and that's really the story that's driven us to cover them again on this episode. And it's an interesting step outside of their common tactics, which have previously been the vishing or that voice phishing with social engineering. And what makes things so difficult right now is that their older tactics, that vishing, is still being used in high volume. Then layer in on top of that the fact that their older attacks are still being weaponized on the dark web and social media, really meaning that they are carrying lingering risks for organizations.
And just in the last week, there were multiple posts by different members of ShinyHunters across criminal forums, such as BreachForums and Telegram, that offer to sell access and data taken from prior attacks, such as the Salesforce SalesLoft Drift incidents, the Vercel compromise, and even to Claude Mythos.
Yeah, exactly. Now, it's important to say that the name ShinyHunters does get thrown around a lot, and that some threat actors use that name despite not actually being affiliated with the group. But all that to say is that the threat landscape around ShinyHunters is confusing about who to trust, and it's difficult to interpret.
Exactly. Which is why in this episode, we're going to break down the latest ShinyHunters news to help organizations distill the information overload that's going on and break things down to the key defense takeaways.
Yeah, all right. So let's get started with that biggest news story, which is that ShinyHunters is highly likely exploiting a 0-day in Oracle's PeopleSoft's Environment Management Hub. The flaw is tracked as CVE 2026-35273, and it's a remote code execution vulnerability with a critical CVSS score of 9.8. It can allow an unauthenticated attacker access for full account takeover. And it's important to understand the software, the Environment Management Hub, is an administrator component of an enterprise resource planning or EPR platform.
And this means that it's likely to hold the exact data the ShinyHunters targets for its extortion campaigns.
Yeah, that's really a key point. You know, this platform holds data from across the organization with things like HR, finance, procurement, and supply chain information. Really, the data that puts heavy extortion pressure on an organization when it's compromised. So let's break down the timeline a little bit. CISA added the CVE to KEV on June 12th, confirming active exploitation in the wild. And separately, security researchers observed exploitation tied to this vulnerability between March 27th and June 9th, and they attribute it to ShinyHunters. The researchers notified more than 100 organizations whose systems appeared exposed. The majority of these organizations were based in the US, and 68% of them operated in higher education.
And the next news story that we're going to hit on is that members of ShinyHunters are likely selling data and access to the organizations that didn't pay extortions from the Salesforce compromises. Specifically on June 9th, ShinyHunters announced on its criminal forum, BreachForums, that they were selling the data and access to the Salesforce instances it had compromised, specifically those organizations that had refused to pay the extortion demands. And they asked for about 300,000 for the full data and access, which they claimed was around 1 million terabytes. The group then stated that it had been accessing these organizations daily to steal new data, and from that data, they knew the opinions, finances, and business partners of those compromised organizations.
Yeah, it's a really interesting trend. And just to kind of put some context on it for our listeners, the data and access they're selling is to all the organizations that didn't pay those extortions. So it probably goes without saying that the sale of this data and access has serious potential to bring follow on attacks and extortion attempts against the organizations that were named, even up to ransomware deployment, which Shiny Hunters explicitly called out in their post. Now, finally, to round out the Shiny Hunters related news, separately on Telegram, someone who claims to be a member of the group was selling data and access related to both the Vercel compromise and even access to Claude Mythos. However, these are low probability claims. Similar posts have been made around the possible compromise of Vercel and Claude Mythos by Shiny Hunters earlier this year. But these were largely disputed, and even to the point where confirmed members of Shiny Hunters denied being involved in the Vercel compromise to reporters. So lots of different news and noise floating around this week. So Tehman, can you tell our listeners, from the stories that we just outlined, what are the primary challenges for organizations and defenders?
And I want to start with the PeopleSoft CVE. And there are two major challenges here. The first one is administrator consoles are being internet facing and are exposed to attacks. The second one is that improper visibility and logging around those SaaS tools. For the first one, the environment management hub doesn't need to be internet facing for it to function. However, it is frequently left exposed to the internet. This means that it's not behind any of those network defenses, and it makes it very easy for attackers to exploit this CVE. Additionally, SaaS logging is very, very important to ensure that organizations can detect, contain, and remediate those attacks.
Yeah, it definitely is. And to kind of layer in here, we mentioned how important SaaS logging was in previous episodes, and that there was a SaaS logging gap in many organizations, specifically in the episode where we talked about the Vercel compromise in Shiny Hunters.
Exactly. And these attacks are just another reminder that organizations need to ensure that they have proper visibility into SaaS applications. In this case specifically, Oracle's PeopleSoft. It's very common for organizations to not be feeding the proper SaaS logging events, whether it's into their SIM or whatever detection tool that they're utilizing. And in many cases, they don't have any logging for these detections at all.
Which is a really important point, because that's exactly why Shiny Hunters has been successful targeting them for data collection and exfiltration.
And really, the next major threat to call out here is around the BreachForums post, selling data and access to organizations who didn't pay those extortions from the Salesforce compromises. We mentioned that there is serious potential for follow-up attacks on those organizations, and the risk extends well beyond traditional network security-based detections. John, can you elaborate on some of those risks a bit more?
Yeah, certainly. So, simply put, the risks really lie in the data and access itself, and how the threat actors who purchase that data will weaponize it for profit. The most obvious are continued extortion attempts or ransomware deployment. And let's break down some of the variations around how that data could be used. So, for example, access codes and credentials within the data may be resold by initial access brokers. Now, typically, the low level credentials for your standard users are going to be posted for cheap prices on criminal marketplaces with lots of automation. Whereas the high value credentials, such as administrator accounts, are going to be sold to the highest bidder on criminal forums. Also, the sensitive company data that's within those could also be sold on criminal forums to fuel more attacks, such as targeted phishing campaigns that impersonate the compromised organization to phish their employees, customers, or third parties that are directly pulled from the data itself. And then in a similar fashion, the data could be used for extreme extortion, which is a step above what we know Shiny Hunters will already do. There have been reports suggesting that Shiny Hunters will go as far as swatting executives to pressure the organizations into paying. Or if you're unfamiliar with that, swatting is essentially where they send the police to the executive's home, pretending that there's an emergency to really put pressure on them. So anyone who purchases the access and data may have to go further and try to cause direct brand and image damage against executives and third parties to ensure that they can profit.
So we've made sense of the flood of recent Shiny Hunters related events and broke them into the primary challenges that defenders need to understand. After the break, we'll cover what organizations can do to defend against them.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Grey Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
All right, welcome back. Let's dive into how organizations should strengthen their defenses. So let's start with that biggest news story, the PeopleSoft CVE. So, Tehman, what are the mitigations that organizations need to implement here?
Number one is to disable the Environment Management Hub, also known as the EM Hub service, in multi-server configurations, or completely remove the PS EM Hub application in single server configurations as mentioned in Oracle's guidance. If you cannot disable or completely remove those, then you should restrict internet access to that EM Hub. Specifically, block all external access to the sensitive endpoint of PS EM Hub and PS IGW / HTTP listening connector through a firewall.
Yeah, and it's important to note that that recommendation you just said will not restrict or will not break the operations of the standard end users.
Absolutely. And then the final recommendation that we have is to ensure you have proper SaaS or PeopleSoft EM Hub logging feeding directly into your SIM or detection tools so that you can alert, contain, and remediate these kinds of attacks. For the attacks around CVE 2026-35273, you should also ensure that you are logging PIA web logic events to monitor for that HTTPS traffic, for access attempts, and server-side request forgery. And the next topic I want to hit on is those follow-up attacks and some of that dark web monitoring. We previously discussed that criminal forum posts that they were using to sell data and access to companies who didn't pay in that Salesforce compromise. John, I'm going to pass it over to you. What are some of the defense recommendations for organizations around this specifically?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, the biggest risk is those follow-on attacks and extortion attempts to organizations and their third parties. But the question I have here for our listeners is, if you're affected, at what stage in the kill chain will you detect these follow-on attacks? You know, there are many detection opportunities within the full kill chain itself that rely on traditional defenses, your IDS, your IPS, your EDR, etc. But most of those will alert later in the kill chain, and we know it's best to stop the attack as early as possible. So really the big recommendation here is to implement some kind of dark web and open web monitoring to see these threats coming in the resource development stage of the kill chain before the attack begins. And this really comes with a shift in thinking too, or that shift left wording that you often hear. But simply put, it means getting away from the reactive nature of detecting attacks later in the kill chain through traditional tools, and instead being proactive to detect attacks before they happen in that resource development stage. Now, a few specific detection methods to call out here are going to be some kind of dark web and criminal form monitoring to detect when credentials and access to your organization are available for sale. Likewise, you can detect when criminals sell or release your data to other threat actors this way. And another important one to call out is going to be dark web, form, and social media marketing to detect signs of executive impersonation or organization impersonation that could be used to fuel those extortion attacks or phishing against your employees, customers, and third parties.
And the most advanced tools and organizations will even pair that dark web detections and automatic response to reset those exposed credentials, block those phishing domains, and alert executives quickly before the attack can even begin. And let's close it out with what you need to do with all of this information. I'll start on the leadership side, and then I'll pass it over to John to talk through the practitioner piece. We'll start with for our CISOs and those security leaders listening. The main point I want you to take away from the BreachForums story is this. The window to stop a follow-on attack isn't just when the attacker is already inside your network. It's before the attack begins. Most security programs are built to detect threats in motion. Those are valuable, but they're reactive by design. They catch an attack after the first move has already been made. Threat actors listing active credentials or access or creating impersonation sites are signals at the resource development stage before the attack has even started. Dark web and open web monitoring is what lets you see that signal and then act on it. That's the shift security leaders need to prioritize, moving from that reactive detection state to that proactive detection before the attack even begins. The tomorrow morning action item that I have for leaders is go to your security team and ask them this. What detections do we have in place at the resource development stage, and how fast can we respond to those detections with password resets or phishing domain blocks? If the answer isn't a fast one with clear automation and a runbook tied behind it, that's the gap that you need to close.
Yeah, it certainly is. So taking things home for the practitioners here, there are some really concrete verifications that are tied to the PeopleSoft CVE. The first and the most urgent is that your Oracle PeopleSoft Environment Hub is not internet facing. So pull your external attack surface or your scanning tool and check that the EM hub or that environment management hub, those endpoints are not externally accessible. Specifically the ones Tehman had called out, the PS EM hub and the PSIGW HTTP listening connector. If you can't disable the service or remove the application entirely, as per Oracle's guidance, then you can use a firewall to restrict access to those endpoints. So second, verify your SaaS logging coverage. As we mentioned, PeopleSoft holds HR, finance, procurement, and supply chain data. And if you're not logging that activity in your platform and feeding it into your detection tools, you don't have the visibility into when an attacker is inside your network. Specifically in this case, you need to make sure that you have the PIA WebLogic access logs configured to monitor HTTP traffic for access attempts and server-side request forgery. Now, your tomorrow morning action is going to extend beyond that in a similar fashion, but more globally to all of your SaaS applications. So the recommendation here is tomorrow morning, catalog all of your SaaS applications in your environment that hold sensitive data that could be extorted, and verify that you have the proper logging feeding into your detection tools, specifically for authentication events and data access events. Not just that logging is enabled, but that you're ready to alert on those logs. So overall this week, there was lots of ShinyHunters related news, really making it difficult to understand who to trust, how to react, and what defenses are needed. But in this episode, we simplified the confusion so you can stay ahead of the threats. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. And please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcast platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.